Brazil's most powerful criminal organizations were not born on the streets. They were not created in poor neighborhoods, nor did they emerge from chaos alone. They were born inside prisons, behind bars, under state control, during a period of repression, neglect, and silence. For decades, the world has tried to understand why organized crime in Brazil became so powerful, why it grew so fast, why it became so structured, and why it proved so difficult to dismantle. The most common explanation points to poverty, inequality, or violence. But these explanations only describe the surface. To understand the origins of Brazil's first criminal organizations, we need to look deeper, not at the streets, but at the system. This is not a story about criminals alone. It is a story about structures, decisions, and long-term consequences. To understand how everything began, we need to return to Brazil in the 1960s and 1970s. At that time, Brazil was living under a military dictatorship. Political opposition was considered a threat to national security. The state ruled through repression, censorship, and force. Prisons were not designed for rehabilitation. They were instruments of control. People were arrested for political reasons, ideological reasons, and criminal offenses, often without clear distinction. The prison system was never prepared to deal with this reality. Overcrowding became the norm. Facilities were deteriorated. Resources were scarce. Cells built to hold a small number of inmates were filled far beyond their capacity. There was no long-term planning, no separation strategy, and no concern for what happened inside those walls. One of the most critical decisions made by the state was to mix different types of prisoners together. Common criminals were placed in the same spaces as political prisoners. Drug offenders shared cells with activists, dissidents, and intellectuals. From the state's perspective, prison was meant to isolate individuals from society. What it failed to understand was that prisons also bring people together. And inside those walls, something unexpected began to form. Political prisoners were not ordinary inmates. Many of them were educated, organized, and ideologically driven. They understood discipline. They followed rules. They believed in collective action and mutual support. For them, survival depended on organization. Common criminals, on the other hand, were used to acting individually. They survived through improvisation, instinct, and personal strength. When these two worlds collided, knowledge began to transfer. Over time, common criminals started observing how political prisoners organized themselves, how they communicated, how they resolved internal conflicts, how they protected one another. This exchange did not happen overnight. It was gradual, subtle, and inevitable. One prison would become especially important in this process: Ilha Grande, an isolated island prison off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. Originally designed to isolate what the state considered dangerous individuals, Ilha Grande became something else entirely. Because of its isolation, oversight was minimal. Control was weak. Neglect was constant. Inside Ilha Grande, the same pattern repeated itself. Different types of prisoners were forced to coexist. And once again, organization emerged as a survival strategy. What the state believed would break men ended up teaching them how to adapt. Within the prison, inmates began forming internal rules. They created systems of mutual aid. They established codes of conduct. Protection became collective. Punishment became organized. Slowly, a new identity began to form. Out of this environment, Brazil's first major criminal organization was born, the Comando Vermelho, the Red Command. At its origin, it was not a drug cartel. It was not a street gang. It was a survival organization. Its purpose was simple: protection inside prison. Members shared food, resources, and information. They defended one another against abuse, both from other inmates and from authorities. They created loyalty through solidarity. Over time, this loyalty became identity. Being part of the group meant belonging. It meant protection. It meant power. For the first time, criminals were no longer isolated individuals. They were part of something larger than themselves. The state, believing prisons were places of isolation, failed to realize what was happening inside. Organization was forming behind walls meant to prevent it. As years passed, members of the Red Command began leaving prison. But they did not leave the organization behind. They carried its structure with them. The discipline learned inside prison was applied outside. The hierarchy remained intact. The loyalty remained strong. What had been created for survival behind bars now became a model for criminal activity on the streets. Territories replaced cell blocks. Street operations replaced prison routines. Prisons themselves evolved into something new. They were no longer places of isolation. They became command centers. From behind bars, leaders communicated orders. They resolved disputes. They coordinated activities. The state continued to believe it controlled prisons. In reality, control was slipping away. As the Red Command grew stronger, its model began to spread. Other factions emerged, inspired by the same structure: discipline, hierarchy, collective power. Brazil's prison system continued to suffer from overcrowding, neglect, and corruption. Instead of dismantling criminal organizations, the system helped replicate them. Each new prison became a potential breeding ground. Each transfer of inmates helped spread ideology and structure. What began as a single group evolved into a network of factions connected by prisons, violence, and power. Organized crime in Brazil was no longer spontaneous. It was systemic. Outside prison walls, the consequences became visible. Criminal factions expanded into neighborhoods. They took control of territories. They imposed rules. In some areas, they replaced the state. They regulated daily life. They enforced their own justice. They controlled local economies. This expansion was not accidental. It was the result of decades of neglect, poor decisions, and institutional failure. Yet, this history is rarely discussed honestly. The narrative often focuses on morality, on individual responsibility, on cultural explanations. But culture does not explain structure. History shows that these organizations did not emerge from chaos alone. They were shaped by systems, by policies, by long-term neglect. Brazil did not create its criminal organizations by mistake. It created them by neglect, by mixing repression with disorganization, by ignoring the consequences of overcrowded prisons, by treating incarceration as an endpoint instead of a process. Until these origins are understood, the cycle continues. Prisons remain overcrowded. Organizations remain active. Violence remains systemic. Understanding how it began does not excuse what followed. But without understanding the origins, there can be no meaningful change. This is not just a story about Brazil. It is a warning about systems, power, and unintended consequences. This was Hidden Brazil.